Well, let me take first the easy part, which is to isolate socialism from the context. The early phase of the establishment of the Kibutzim, before the First World War and before the 1920s really, was not only devoid of socialism, it was anti-socialist. It's a combination of an alliance between Rupin, whose ideas were not socialist at all, and who was obviously a pivotal player in this, and the settlers themselves, who belonged to this ideologically, basically to this certainly anti-Marxist and non-socialist religion, Tolstoyan religion of labor, which was laborite and which emphasized menial labor and communal living and collective effort, but was not socialist. Socialism and even Marxism enters the fray later with the arrival of what is called in Zionist jargon the third Aliyah, which had people who had experienced more thoroughly, or experienced in the first place, the rise of socialism in Europe. Some of them were active in the Bolshevik Revolution, and so they had a clearly Marxist, certainly socialist, and some of them even Marxist ideology. I grew up part of my life in a kibbutz that was openly Marxist, and I remember, for instance, we had one of the kibbutz founders was my main educator. She was the head of what was called the Children's Society, and I remember wanting to read, because I had read from a friend in the city, Enid Blyton, in translation into Hebrew, of course, The Secret Seven and so forth. And I remember her telling me with this heavy Russian accent in Hebrew, "My dear boy, we don't have bourgeois literature in this place." So there's certainly was that. I think what I am coming out against, and so does Gershon Shafir, is first of all that the genealogy is clearly socialist. In other words, it's some socialist utopia in Europe, which then they try to implement. Not true. The idea of the Kibutzim is a colonial idea, and this is its foundations, and what explains it is the need to settle and acquire land and create an independent labor market in Palestine, which was conceived as the best. And the impact again of the German project in the Ostmark is absolutely crucial. It's much more important than socialism. And more importantly, the idea is to insist that there is no collective identity of settler societies that is separable from the need to remove the antigens. And even if if socialism comes into it at some point, into the kibbutzim, this doesn't mean that it explains it in an insular way from the conflict with the natives. That's the main point. And of course, all the socialism of this kibbutzim, including the one I grew up in, didn't prevent them from participating in the looting of Palestinian land in the 50s after the 48 Nakba. So this Israeli secularism, when you say that there are two poles, is it biblical or some secular thing? The problem is that they collapse together. And what I quote is a brilliant title of a friend of mine, an article that a friend of mine wrote, Amnon Raz-Krakotskin, on this oxymoron called Israeli secularism. And he entitles the article, "There is no God, but he promised us the land." And that's, you see, that's precisely the oxymoron or the paradox. And I think they are inseparable. I think basically what you saw in all this settlement project is a state project in which what comes together is a messianic settler use of the Bible. It is true that there is a certain, nothing is homogenic and there are nuances and differences that are important. So the messianic religious wing of the settlement project, the Gush Emunim, the settlers, the religious settlers, have their ideology, which is not identical with so-called secular Zionism. But I think the similarities are more important than the differences. And one of the mistakes that many people make is to attribute this irredentism, settlement, annexation, dispossession, and so forth to Orthodox Jews, as if the problem is rabbinical Judaism and they identified it with the Jews who wear the long black gowns, and these are not the problem. They are actually Orthodox rabbinical Jews who have nothing to do now because they have power through coalitions. They try to make use for their own constituency the best they can. But the problem is secular Zionism and the messianic settler movement to which it gave rise after 1967. I think, first of all, concerning the one-state solution, there is the prescriptive or the preferred path of those of us who would like it, and there is the objective reality. I'm not saying they're that easily separable sometimes, but let me say first, one of the things that could be taken from my book, and although I don't say it directly, and this lecture, is that if you want to understand the two-state solution, it's inherent that the foundations are the pure settlement colonial logic. In other words, the fact that what they want to do is first of all create segregation from the natives. If possible, get rid of them completely, even better. But if not, at least create a situation in which there's no porousness whatsoever. That's the logic of the wall, that's the logic of the Oslo agreements, that's basically the... But to go back to the one-state solution, I think there are two things. I think Zionism is something that has to be gotten rid of if this particular part of the world, Western Palestine, which is very small, is going to have some sort of life that is just. And I know in what world we live in, it's not just, and it's not, but within what can be termed realistically just, it's predicated upon the removal of Zionism. It's incongruous with, it's an ideology that is premised upon settler supremacy. Not only in ideology, also in history, practice, institutions, and so forth. And I think a one state, by definition, will end the Zionism as the framework within which people, both the victims and the victimizer, live. There is no American history or South African history that is not the history of white supremacy. In other words, you cannot study the history. What they do, even the liberal ones, is to say, okay, we'll be more liberal in the way we study the conflict. But the conflict is a separate department. It's the conflict between Israeli Jews and Palestinians and other Arabs. And then there's another narrative, which is the history of Zionism, of our identity, of how we treated the Bible, of the Kibutzim, and so on and so forth. If you want to take a position that is at least non-Zionist, you have to collapse them into one. There is no history of Zionism that is not a history of the conflict with the Palestinians. And when I was responding to your question on the Kibbutzim, the main point is not that socialism did not appear at some point. They had some sort of, in certain Kibbutzim movement, not all of them. The thing is that you cannot study it separately from the Kibbutzim as a tool for colonization. And once you separate the Kibbutzim as segregated things that have nothing to do with the project of colonization, you collude with the Zionist narrative. And that's the main point.